Hi. I suspect a lot of you have come across the term purchasing power parity in your reading of the news and searching around for income inequality and for GDPs and GDPs per capita, things like that, or maybe in reading something from the IMF or World Bank or something like that, you've come across this term PPP. Maybe you haven't, maybe it's a new term. So PPP is a way of comparing prices and values of currency across different countries. If we obeyed the law of one price around the world, that would mean that the prices in all of the different places would be the same, and we could only then just, if we left the United States with $1,000, then what we could buy for $1,000 in the United States, we would be able to buy anywhere in the world by just changing that currency. Right? So, for example, phones are a good example of PPP being roughly, or the law of one price being roughly followed around the world for iPhones especially, because almost all the Apple stores seem to have pretty much the same prices, just multiplied or divided by the local exchange rate. Right? So PPP, with regard to Canadian purchase of an iPhone, would be 1.35, which is exactly the same as the local currency unit per US dollar. So the real exchange rate, we might say, and there might be nothing real about the real exchange rate because it's not the exchange rate that you get at the bank. That would be the official or the nominal exchange rate. This is just a ratio of the local to US price, right? Given that is 1, and this is exactly the same as the official exchange rate, then our over-under valuation, another term you might have heard about currencies, that would be nil, right? So that is perfectly valued currency with respect to this phone. Right, and we might find this is true a lot of places around the world with respect to a phone, but then if we look at the hamburger, and in the second half of this video we'll take a quick look at the Big Mac index, which might have originated the term real exchange rate and had an influence or came about around the same time that PPP was being developed. Now, with respect to a hamburger, let's say in Korea, a $4.25 hamburger bought in the United States costs 4,300 Korean won. Our exchange rate at the bank here, the official exchange rate, is 1180 Korean won per US dollar. And so given those numbers, if we plug them into our little equations here, implied purchasing power parity is the ratio of foreign price to US price, or exchange rate to real exchange rate. And then our over-under valuation is that PPP minus the exchange rate over the exchange rate. We end up getting 1.17, 1011.3, and negative 0.143. And so 1011.3 you can see is slightly lower than the Korean won actual value. And this right here implies that you can buy slightly more. And so if we took $4.25 times 1180, $4.25 times 1180, we get 5,015. And so we would expect that a hamburger would cost 5,015, but since it didn't, then our PPP does not match the Korean won. And since it's actually, the local price is actually a little bit lower, then this is a little bit lower, meaning that the real exchange rate is greater than 1. And thus we could say that our local currency is overvalued because we're buying more for less. We're buying more for less. So it's slightly overvalued because, again, we're buying more for less. More hamburger, anyway, for less Korean won than we might expect given the law of one price. And so this one is a phone. Phone's perfectly correlated across countries. This one is the burger in Korea. Now let's look at the shoes in Mexico. So the shoes in the United States, we're using that as our base price. Don't ask me why, or if you ask me why, then I'll probably just say because we're biased, and for some reason we've not moved on to find a better system than using the dollar standard. Or I suppose we could split that up and say also that the U.S. economy has a disproportionately large number of the Fortune 500 companies which do operations worldwide. The US economy is the largest national economy. It's very influential, powerful, and stable in the world economy, and so just given how things worked out in the 20th century, that's what we got. But to say that it is biased is certainly not untrue. Anyway, US dollar price of these shoes is 110, and then if we go to Mexico, say we take our $110, go to the bank, and we want to exchange that into Mexican pesos, we're going to get an official exchange rate of 21. So take our $110, multiply that by 21, we walk out of the bank with 2,310 Mexican pesos. We cross the border, we go into the shoe shop, and we try to buy the same shoes, and we find those shoes are 1,800 Mexican pesos. Well, we got a deal. So the price locally is actually lower, much like the hamburger was in Korea, and so we can expect this number will be greater than 1, this number will be less than the official exchange rate, and this number will be negative. And what I got on my paper that I calculated already, 1.05, greater than 1, 20, less than 21, and negative 0.05. So we can say this currency is slightly overvalued with respect to the shoes. And it's important that we indicate that it's with respect to the shoes, because prices fluctuate and vary from country to country based on a lot of factors. In Mexico, maybe they made the shoes in Mexico, and that's why they're cheaper. Maybe the price of the shoes is cheaper because of taxes or business licensing or wages. There are a lot of variable and fixed costs that are seriously different from country to country. And so if we are of the belief that markets should determine prices, then maybe we should not believe so much in the law of one price, because if we wanted to mandate that the prices were the same in every country, well, that would be A, unfair to the people who live there who don't make as much money, and B, contrary to market principles, whereby local people would then choose the prices through their own means, through their own methods. All right, so let's look at purchasing power parity and real exchange rate and over-under valuation with respect to the car in Saudi Arabia. So the car costs 78,000 Saudi riyal and costs $17,000. So say again, I wanted to buy the car in the United States, we're using that as our base price. And we know that the Saudi riyal has a fixed exchange rate of 3.75, which is unlike any of the other four, or any of the other three, because those vary from day to day, hour to hour, whereas the Saudi riyal is fixed, pegged to the US dollar, and so it goes up and down next to the US dollar and changes against other currencies based on how strong or weak the US dollar becomes. And so I take that $17,000 multiplied by 3.75 at my local bank or wherever I get my Saudi riyal, and I walk out of the bank with 63,750 riyal. I fly to Saudi Arabia, which I'm not going to talk about the cost of because that would add another factor into it. Although, if I'm paying 78,000 riyal for that car, there's a decent chance that I'd be able to fly to Saudi Arabia, buy that car. I'm sorry. I would be able to fly from Saudi Arabia to the United States, buy the car, put it in a container and ship it back to Saudi Arabia for cheaper than the price I would pay in Saudi Arabia. Because instead of that, remember I went into the American bank with my $17,000 for the car, I exchanged it for 3.75 riyal per dollar. I got 63,750 riyal back, but the cost of the car in Saudi Arabia is 78,000. And so, given that it's way more expensive there than it is in the US, we should expect this to be less than 1. This will be far greater than 3.75, and this will be greater than 0. And so, as I've done it already, 0.63 with respect to the car. PPP then is 5.91. So this is the exchange rate that we would need to make the values of this product the same in both countries. And then 0.56. It is undervalued. Seriously, you're not buying nearly as much for as much. So these two currencies are overvalued because you can buy more for less this currency is undervalued because you can buy less for more. And so is the story of PPP. We're using US dollars to come up with indications of how prices should fall in other countries based on the official exchange rate, but also using goods and services to compare those values. But we're not really taking a lot of care to consider market forces, taxes, wages, fixed and variable costs, as well as other quality and service standards that you might see are different in different places. So the question today is PPP a good measure? Is it useful? Or is it maybe just some kind of special magic that makes $3 look like 4 or $5 look like 2 for some other reason? And we'll get to that in a moment. PPP was developed around the same time as the Economist magazine developed the Big Mac Index. McDonald's is a unique brand for a lot of reasons. One was that it pursued standardization, and so you can walk into any McDonald's anywhere in the world and you'll be able to buy any or all of the same products. And so that standardization allowed the company and economists to study exchange rates and how much purchasing power a currency has compared to how much it might have in another country. And so this is from The Economist. Purchasing power of parity implies that exchange rates are determined by the value of goods that currencies can buy. Now, exchange rates are developed or are defined by a complex series of equations referencing against other currencies, the value of goods and services sold within a country, GDP, and you can look that up on your own. There are different methods for calculating the official exchange rate. In this case, it's saying that it should be a comparative form of how much a currency can buy in each country, and i.e. that a currency should be able to buy the same amount in every country, and that exchange rate should be calculated based on that equal value across countries. So different local prices, in our case for Big Mac, can suggest what the rate should be. So if you have a $5 Big Mac in the United States that costs 20 yuan in China, well, never mind that Chinese people don't eat hamburgers for the same reasons that American people do them. It's not traditionally Chinese food. Never mind that a Chinese worker at McDonald's might get paid, say, 10 yuan per hour, which is far less than $5. Never mind that it would take a Chinese worker, at least a few years ago, it would take several hours of work to buy a value meal at the workplace, McDonald's, compared to an American worker who would have to work for less than an hour. The exchange rate by the Big Mac Index is 4-to-1, so 4 yuan per $1 US, which would imply that the Chinese yuan, as we've heard many times, is, quote, undervalued, because the actual exchange rate is somewhere in the area of 6.4, somewhere around 7, something like that. It changes every day. And so even the US Treasury has argued that the Chinese yuan was undervalued based on this idea that the value of goods and services in a country should determine the exchange rate. And so the Big Mac Index is something The Economist has put on for years, and it's an interesting measure, but I'm not personally convinced that it means all that much. Again, I like to consider PPP that special magic that turns $3 into 4 or $5 into 2, something like that. And so by the Big Mac Index, it says the British pound is 22% undervalued. It looks like nearly all currencies the economists surveyed are undervalued against the US dollar, whereas only Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland are overvalued. Now, we might question, why would a country intentionally over or undervalue? And that would be a charge of currency manipulation. In the case of exporting countries, they would want an undervalued currency so that they can export more products for a lower price in the countries which are importing. And for a country that overvalues intentionally, they would want to import more products, perhaps more expensive US products, when they don't have that value locally. Now, again, determining exchange rate is a very complex thing. So the value index created by a single Big Mac certainly doesn't have as much substance to it or merit to its argument as some people might believe. However, it is an interesting idea, I suppose. So we can see that given the price differences of Big Macs, which again probably aren't very popular in most countries for a lot of reasons, taste being one, fat and salt and sugar content being another, but according to the law of one price, then they should be the same. And so people like the economists and others who believe in this type of thing would then charge that country of overvaluing or undervaluing. However, charges of overvaluing are extremely rare, probably because politically those are more favorable to countries like the United States, which is trying to export expensive products. That aside, let's have a look at maybe why prices would vary between countries. And so we could think of GDP per capita as the price of labor, right? And so the price of labor we know is variable between countries, otherwise there wouldn't be so many factories in China and so few in the United States, right? We can see that GDP per capita is very high in the United States. And again, this is not really saying how well people are off, but it's taking the entire output of the country, dividing that by the population. So on average, a person earns or has more in the United States than they do in these lighter colored spots in the world in 2019. And you can see that GDP per capita is nearly uniform at 21 to 36,000 across the globe, and only a few are up in that 36 to 53,000 and 53,000 or more. 53,000 or more, if you followed yesterday's video, is not indicative of a very high-class existence in one of these countries. In fact, this is square in the middle of middle class. And globally, that standard stands out, however. So middle class in the United States is doing very, very well throughout the world. And so if we want to have price equality, well then it seems that labor should follow the same trend also. But we don't see that. Back in 1990, they were closer. Only one country or two or three were in that higher range, and only a couple were in that upper range again, where most of the world was in that middle and lower range. So we can see a little bit of movement in some countries, but the main idea here is that income is variable, and this is GDP per capita in current US dollars. Let's have a look at PPP. Well, it's nearly the same. Let's have a look at 2019. We see some blue, dark blue, dark blue, dark blue, and I think Russia is darker. Yep, Russia is darker given PPP. Parts of Scandinavia are darker. Argentina, Chile are darker. Saudi Arabia is darker. Parts of Europe are darker. So you can see that PPP clearly inflates the value locally. But does that mean that people in Russia and Kazakhstan are doing so much better? Not really in real terms, but using this crafty measure, well, yeah. Looking back at 2002, in real dollars, the US was poorer. Sorry, in real dollars, the US was richer than it was in PPP. PPP dollars, it's actually poorer. Right? So, but elsewhere around the world, PPP international dollars, we can see that changing to PPP actually makes it darker. You can see Scandinavia throughout Europe is that Tunisia, even Australia gains by changing to PPP. And let's look at 1990, switching back and forth. You can see Scandinavia is darker, Greenland shows up, Canada is lighter, Saudi Arabia is darker again, So generally speaking, we see the trend is that PPP makes something more valuable, especially in poorer countries. And so why bother, really? You know, what is the point here is the real question. What is going on if the grocery, here's the grocery index at market prices. So just color-coded, darker means more expensive. You can see it's very expensive in Greenland, very expensive in Australia. Australia is mostly desert, quite expensive up here. Japan, and parts of sub-Saharan Africa, which are somewhat surprising. Somalia, which is a failed state, not terribly surprising. Venezuela, which has suffered rapid inflation, right? Switzerland, not terribly surprising because everything's expensive there. Now, let's compare the grocery index to just 1 liter of milk. Well, we can see groceries in general are more expensive in Greenland than a gallon of milk, possibly because livestock tending is common there. We can see that a gallon of milk in China is slightly more expensive than the grocery index. We can see that a gallon of milk here in Australia is slightly cheaper than the grocery index. We can see that in Somalia, a gallon of milk is cheaper than the grocery index as a whole. Again, looking at France, the price of a gallon of milk is slightly cheaper, but let's try to find one that's more expensive. So where is it darker here? Darker for a gallon of milk. Over in Peru, it's slightly more expensive. Again, in China, slightly more expensive than the index. And so different things in that basket of goods vary from country to country. And that makes sense. You know, there are different factors that increase the price of cheese versus the price of a loaf of bread versus the price of a kilogram of rice. Right? Boneless, skinless chicken breast, you can see not a whole lot of variance around the world. You can see poorer countries like India are a little cheaper, but down here in sub-Saharan Africa, which is poorer than China, for example, it's actually more expensive. And so the price and the national income or the national capacity to purchase that good don't necessarily relate, right? And so what PPP might be trying to do is establish a baseline where we could say that some goods and services are more expensive in some countries and some goods and services are less. But when we look at various categories and various goods and services, we can see such variance that whether or not lumping them all together serves a purpose other than the one I'll state in a moment, it remains uncertain. So a pack of Marlboros, this is unessential. Or wine, we can see wine is very expensive in Saudi Arabia where it's illegal. It's very expensive in Iran where it's not very common. It's very expensive in this Algeria, where it might not be legal. It's quite cheap in France, quite cheap throughout Europe where it's readily available. It's more expensive in China. And so the idea that the Chinese yuan is somehow undervalued because it isn't buying something or because it can buy more of something in China than the equivalent cost, the equivalent price in euros would be in Europe, doesn't necessarily translate across categories of goods. And in the case of cigarettes, for example, taxes most certainly influence this pattern. So there are all these different market and non-market forces that relate to how PPP is calculated and what value PPP has. Now, if we look at quota, this is probably the most important takeaway from PPP. It's used to determine at the IMF what the quota is in a country. Now, quota will determine how much money the IMF can loan a country. And so the IMF changed its formula, right? Percentage difference from new to previous. We can probably see that poorer countries, such as India, can borrow more. Russia, Mexico,
poorer countries can borrow more from Brazil, the IMF, and richer countries can borrow less because they're using PPP in the new formula. And so I'm not convinced that PPP has a lot of value, because if you take whatever dollars or euros or real or yuan or baht or whatever it might be and go to the bank and exchange those and bring them to another country, well, you're immersed in an entirely different environment. If you go to a restaurant, whether you're buying hamburgers or chop suey or whatever, you are subject to different health and hygiene standards. The workers there are getting lower or more pay. There is or isn't health insurance to speak of. There are just different health and safety standards. There are different constituent parts of products. There are different qualities to different products. There are so many variables that I'm not sure that any of this is directly comparable. And this is why the OECD had this red, yellow, green recommendation for PPP. So to use comparisons of GDP sizes of economies, I'm not so sure about that. I think that the nominal exchange rate is perfectly acceptable. Labor productivity. Well, if a laborer in China gets paid a very low price and does a lot of work, then her value is obviously a lot greater than what we might see in a country where the minimum wage is quite high and they do relatively the same work or even less work. But maybe that means that where the prices are high, it's actually overvalued. And if PPP in the United States is one, then we're not really factoring the changes and differences in values with regards to that. So it's already a skewed difference in favor of the United States, or in some cases against its own interests or the interests of its own people. To make spatial comparisons in price levels, sure, to some extent, to group countries by their volume index of GDP or AIC per head, to some extent, but what we shouldn't use that for is as a precise measure or strict rankings, okay. As a means of constructing national growth rates, okay, but it seems that the IMF is sort of doing that. As measures to generate output and productivity comparisons by industry, well, not by industry, but the IMF using PPP in its calculation of the quota is using PPP to determine how much each country pays into the IMF and how much each country can borrow from the IMF. So it's used in formal valuations and comparisons as indicators of the undervaluation or overvaluation of currencies. Well, then if they're not using PPP as indicator of an over or undervaluation of currency, then how are they coming up with calculations for those? Can we just say that there are no undervalued or overvalued currencies? And as equilibrium exchange rates? Well, nobody's using it for that. And so main idea here, main takeaway is that it's important to look at the details and think about what's going on, and can you even compare prices when you've got differences in real price, differences in nominal exchange rate, and then differences with regard to how much work that takes. For example, a car, the big ticket items especially. Now we can take a basket of grocery goods and some clothes and things, and it depends on what brands and what materials and how far they've traveled and various things to come up with that price at the market. But let's look at the big ticket items, because there's a wide difference here. Now in Australia, a Honda Civic is $23,950, which takes on average 31.9 weeks of work to purchase. In Japan, it takes only 19.4 weeks. Why? Because the Honda Civic is Japanese and Australia probably has import taxes. Now the price isn't so different in the US. It's just about 25% higher, but the difference in the number of weeks worked is just over 50%, and so that just means that income in Japan is relatively higher. Now, how can we control for these different variables as they're all rising and falling within the same comparison, right? So if we pay $56,000 in Australia, $43,000 in the US, $51,000 in the UK, and $42,000 in the BMW and it takes all these different amounts of work to purchase that, is it realistic that we can come up with a singular index that somehow equalizes all of these prices? And then there are other variables that aren't being taken into consideration here. So, again, main takeaway, use PPP at your own risk. It might not be all that it's cracked up to be. Thank you.